Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 257 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Medieval people loved their sports, especially when those sports also gave them practical skills. As something that checked both of these boxes, falconry was one of the most popular medieval pastimes across the known world. More than just a pleasant diversion in the countryside, it was a way to show status, education, sophistication, and leadership. This week, I spoke with Dr. Yannis Hadjinicolaou about medieval falconry. Yannis is assistant professor of art history at the University of Bonn and the author of Thinking Bodies, Shaping Hands, Handling in Art and Theory of the Late Rembrandtists, as well as many articles on art, visual culture, and falconry in both. His new book is The Art of Medieval Falconry. Our conversation on who was enjoying this pastime, where we find the evidence, and why falconry was such a popular metaphor for both love and power is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Yannis, for joining me to talk about the art of medieval falconry. This is very exciting because falconry is such a beautiful sport, and it's just a gorgeous thing to watch, and I'm just happy to be talking about falconry with you this morning.
I'm very happy to talk to you too. Good morning.
Welcome. It's morning for me. It's not morning for you, but that happens almost all the time on this podcast.
I know.
All right. So falconry, I think most people have a sense of it, but can you give us a description of what this would look like in the Middle Ages? So say somebody wants to go out hunting with a falcon. What does this look like?
Well, I think foremost what we could say about falconry, which is actually almost valid until today, is that you go hawking, obviously, with your falcon hawk. In the Middle Ages, obviously, with a horse or horses and dogs, and without any other weapons, right? So your weapon is your falcon, and you go and send the hawk to catch quarry. And there has not changed much until today, actually, apart of several technological devices that changed a bit the game. And of course, there were also already starting in the Middle Ages, several other instruments that one used to take into account if one wanted to go hawking, such as the hood, for instance, or the lure, the hood to cover the hawk's head before sending her to catch quarry and tranquilize her a bit, or then the lure to call her back. You might ask yourself, why do I say her all the time? It is because most of the hawks or falcons we are talking about were female. These were the bigger, the stronger, the faster ones. Of course, male falcons were used as well, but these are actually female falcons, which were the swiftest, fastest, strongest ones, and which actually has also a lot to do, as we might talk later about, on the imagery, how much gender relations are actually dealt with through the vehicle of the falcon.
Mm-hmm. So when people are going out hawking, how many people are going at the same time? Because sometimes in medieval art, and your book is dealing with medieval art, sometimes you'll have a party where there are a whole bunch of people and they have a whole bunch of hawks. How does this work? Is it just one hawk at a time? Does everyone just release all their birds at once? How does this look in practice?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because, of course, we deal to think of one lonely hawker, falconer, or maybe an aristocrat or even a king or a prince go out hawking. But this actually was a small industry, actually, with many different people that were employed either at the court. So, of course, we had big hawking parties where several people used to go out hawking together. But we also had, of course, smaller parties. It depended the way that someone used to well, let's say how much money they would like to spend, right? So it's a lot also about cost. That was a very costly, a highly costly sport, and it is still today, if one looks at the United Arab Emirates, for instance. And of course, we had the riders, right, with the accompanying dogs, and we had many servants. If it was a bigger party, the so-called cagers, for instance, who used to carry the hawks. And we see specifically a bit later on, one might say from the 15th century onwards, those cagers depicted as well. So it involved a great deal of different kind of people that used to participate in this kind of party. And of course, because it was a spectacle with a huge, if you like, visual impact, it also used to have also audiences. It also used to have political and diplomatic relations, being part of this hawking party, and of course also of certain like political decisions that used to be taken up later on. So yeah, it is a quite complicated and highly elevated art. And from the very beginning, I think this is also important to mention that here, is that it was not just a mere hunting, it was an art. That's why in the art of hunting with birds, the Arte Venandi cum Avibus of Frederick II, he already employs the term ars, technique, and he also uses that in a highly aesthetic way, almost one that one could term, one talks about a work of art in a similar way as one talks about falconry, as one talks about his or her own falcons, etc.
I do want to come back around to Frederick II and the art of falconry, but before we leave the practical matters, I just wanted to ask one more question to make sure that we're all on the same page, and that is, what kind of game are these falcons going for? So what are they sending them out for?
Well, these are mostly smaller birds, right? Partridges, for instance. If one looks almost at today in Kazakh Mongolia, where we also employ the term falconry, where the Kazakh Mongols are actually hunting with eagles, they even go after foxes. But the, say, smaller birds like hawks and falcons, of course, we use that as a generic term. We can talk about many kind of different kind of falcons involved there, but these go after smaller animals, not that big as a fox. And I think, of course, the quarry is quite important, but the whole business around it, the whole game around it, right? The whole party, it's about fun. It's about having fun, and also about thinking how to pursue quarry in a sense that it is also, if you like, a pedagogical, on the one hand, tool, and of course, a political one as well. So the quarry is important, but it is not the most important thing.
Right. I know that when it comes to art and portraying a falcon or a hawk, the quarry does factor in. So I figure we should figure it out before we get any further into things. Okay, so we've talked about Frederick II. Can you give us a quick rundown on who he is and why he's so important to falconry as a history?
Well, Frederick II, as a Staufic emperor, is a figure that is already a transcultural entity, if you like, because through this vast imperium kingdom of his, he managed also to put up transcultural relations on the daily basis. And one of those transcultural relations was also falconry. And what is striking on that, and what fascinates me personally, is the fact that Frederick, as an avid falconer himself, he wanted from very early on, I mean, there were several people before him, of course, as well, because falconry was also already in the early Middle Ages a very organized sport. But what Frederick managed to do are several things, and I might give you some examples. because it is a huge subject, right? And a subject on its own. So one of the things that he managed to do is to, because he was so much interested in falconry, is that he gathered falconers from, at his time, all the parts of the known world, because for him it was quite striking and important that falconry as a cultural technique involves also the respective culture to be pursued with. The Arabs did it in a different way as the Europeans, for instance. And the Arabs, indeed, by reviving also an Aristotelian tradition that for Frederick was very important, they also used to write treatises in Arabic, and highly complicated and important treatises, all involving falconry, but also trying to deal with falconry diseases like gout, podagra. And Frederick was very interested into that. So he tried to gather all this kind of knowledge under his roof, which, as a court which had this transcultural, if we might say today, global kind of appeal, right? Through that, falconry was a very important tool to do this. But he was a fascinated falconer himself. So not only the falconers were important to him, but also to possess as many and different kinds of falcons as possible with all their features. So he almost had an encyclopedic, universal kind of pursuit that also makes him quite unique. And maybe the third and last example on Frederick was that we talked about a little bit at the beginning of your first question about these instruments involved, like the hood, for instance. And the hood indeed was something that Frederick himself, while being in the Holy Land, he saw it there, that the Arabs were using that, calling it burqa. And he said, wow, this is a great way to tranquilize the falcon, has so many stimuli and wants to go after quarry and wastes a lot of her energy. So he developed further the so-called burqa, the so-called hood, that even became, if you like, an iconic visual example of falconry reflected in several images later. So he combines many different layers into falconry. And last but not least, he wrote, as already mentioned, a huge book full with his own observations and commentaries that is a huge medieval source, not only on falcons, but on ethology in general, and also the way of interacting, of human-animal relations, interactions with falcons, and employing them into falconry and beyond.
Yes, and this is, as you say, it's encyclopedic and it pops up everywhere. So give us a sense, when was this put together as a book and where do you find it later on?
What we have now is practically the so-called Manfredi manuscript, which derives from his son, and it is a kind of transcription of this corpus, accompanied by beautiful images. It is today in the Vatican Library, around 1245 to 1248. And it was so influential that it was immediately copied in several manuscripts, being accompanied with several images throughout the centuries. Especially in the 15th century, we have a vast different kind of manuscripts for different families who wanted to have a kind of a copy, especially in today France or Belgium, Burgundy. And it was printed actually fairly late. The first edition is from the late 16th century, but it was printed in Augsburg. So there, because Frederick was Germanic emperor, we could call him German today, it was interesting to see how this heritage of his was looked at as very important. So In Augsburg, the city in South Germany, they wanted to have a printed version which contains only 2 prints.
So when you're looking for art and falconry, you're immediately going for this book. This is the book to look at. But where else did you find sources when you wanted to find art that involved falconry?
Well, we have several sources and several kinds of images. We have sculptures, beautiful sculptures around churches, portals. We have, of course, prints, of course, notably from the 15th century onwards. We also do have paintings, and later on, and which is quite fascinating, and even if it is a medieval podcast, I have to say this, until today, contemporary art, we have a vast kind of images from drones, videos, all related to falconry.
Yes, and I think that for people who are interested in falconry, they should read your book anyway. But one of the parts that I found very interesting in your book is the way that you pulled out how art was still being used around falconry, around, for example, Nazi Germany. Like, this is very interesting.
Yes, what is also amazing about that, because of course we know several kinds of medieval receptions, right, in Nazi Germany, for instance, but the whole part of falconry, it is as if it never existed. And I think it has to do with the fact that if one looks in a broader visual culture, also, of course, falconry is a kind of visual culture. And the National Socialists in Germany even employed someone who had a great relations to Goering, who was not only a falconer, who was not only the founder of the German Association of Falconry, it still exists today, but he was also an artist. And he was an artist who painted animal paintings from Düsseldorf. Düsseldorf has a huge tradition to this. And we have a next step, which somehow is, let's say, the cherry on the cake, which is that this person, Renzwala was his name, he acted even as a curator during a hunting exhibition, also on falconry, held in 1937. So practically simultaneously to the Entartete Kunst exhibition, and he acted as a curator, curating his own paintings, but also putting up the lineage and heritage, the medieval heritage in one kind of Aryan line, if you like, and also trying also to involve the global pursuit, especially with the Indian subcontinent and the Arab world up to Japan for obvious reasons. So we see how much this medieval reception is used for political purposes in 1937, and people also in this catalog that was published 1937, and it was visited by a vast audience. Over 500,000 people, I think, went to that exhibition, and the works are described in a way that all the negative racist vocabulary that is being used on the Entartete Kunst exhibition, the degenerate art exhibition, are being used as a positive example through falconry. So you see, it is highly politicized and actually totally overlooked.
And I think that it's important to pull this out because we do know that there's a huge connection between pulling out this medieval past and creating a mystique around the National Socialists and what they're trying to accomplish. So I think that it would be a mistake to overlook falconry. So I think it's important that you've brought it up in the book. But I'm going to bring us back to the Middle Ages now and talk about
sure.
and talk about the political symbolism of the falcon. And I think one of the places where you get at it really well in the book is talking about gifts. So can we talk about gift giving and the place of the falcon in gift giving and how this is political?
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole business and trade of falconry and falcon trade was already very well established in the 9th century and actually much earlier, because, for instance, the King of Norway used to send gyr falcons the most prestigious and valuable and very expensive falcons, to different kinds of sovereigns around his known world. But we also have examples that go up to Alexandria, Northern Africa, today Egypt. So we see very fast that there is a whole kind of network that is based, and relations, political relations, that is based as a vehicle through the diplomatical gift offering of falcons. And it is staged very cleverly. And of course, while sending this huge party or the ambassadors over there, of course, they used to put them into flight, and then they got to deal on different kind of subjects and talk about business, if we would like to term today. So falconry is a wonderful vehicle for this, and it is wonderful because it is, on the one hand, there are those kind of different cultural techniques that we talked about already with Frederick, but there is a commonality through the sport of falconry as a kind of vehicle of understanding. So it is a wonderful way, like today people go to play golf and then talk business on several things, to do that through falconry. And we have those wonderful examples of those people involved into this. And it is huge. It was a huge business. Trappers going to catch the birds, bringing them all around the known world, then sending them over there where they wanted to be, etc. Falconry is a very special kind of subject because, and I think this is also important to stress here, we do not deal with, let's say, diamonds or jewelry. You give them, then you're maybe happy, maybe you can gain someone, but we have very subversive actors. Those falcons cannot be tamed, and they can be aggressive. They can be also loving birds. We know that from several books up to date. Helen Macdonald's H is for Hawk, for instance. But this, let's say, potential aggressivity or potential peaceful nature, if one treats the falcon correctly, is a wonderful metaphor or symbol of prospective relations. Are you going to be my friend or are you going to be my enemy? So I think this is also something very important to stress, the nature of the gift and the specific kind of vehicle that we are talking about here. They are not dead specimens. And the whole game, if you like, is to create an artificial wildness within which the falcon may act as if being in her natural habitat. And I think this is also why it is such a huge symbol or metaphor for a sovereign's power. Can he or she deal with his or her subjects in the way as he or she can deal with a falcon? And if yes, and if this should be successful, this could be only if the falcon gets enough space. The falcon is the master and not the human who supposedly masters the falcon. And I think this has also had a huge importance in diplomatic terms as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it occupies such a strange space in that, as you're saying, it has a mind of its own. I think you mentioned in the book, you call it an autonomous weapon. So you're handing a king, a sovereign, you're handing them a weapon that might turn on them. And then the sovereign themselves has to go out and perform this action with the falcon. So it's a lot of pressure while still being a sport. It's very much like golf, and the way that you're saying, I was thinking that too, where you're going out and you're having a discussion over sport, but it's much more loaded than that on both sides. Because if you've handed someone a tricky falcon that's going to scratch the sovereign, that's not great. But at the same time, the sovereign has to perform this really well in order to show that they kind of deserve to be there.
Exactly. And this is also not by any chance, I think, that since the 15th century, we have a genre of portraits with small children that are portrayed with the falcon, like Charles V, for instance. And this subject becomes quite autonomous in the course of the centuries. So it is important as a child from aristocracy to show that you are already able to do this, right? If you are you, as you said it, I think this is very correct. Do you deserve to be there? Well, yes, you deserve to be there if you are a good falconer, right? So, and that's why I think this is so much stressed already with these children portraits.
Yeah, it's such an important part of nobility. And as you're saying, identity, when you're building your identity as a noble person. So falcons show up a lot when people are talking about chivalry. So can you tell us a little bit about what we're kind of getting there already, but what the place of the falcon is for the nobility, not just the kings, but people who are trying to show their prowess, their status? How does that work when it comes to falcons and the lower nobility underneath the royalty?
Yeah, well, it is, let's say, a huge attribute. As we have Christ with the cross, even for the lower nobility is a man or a woman with a falcon. And carrying even this falcon is such a huge gesture of power, of belonging. And I think also, of course, that the artworks or the poems or the texts that reflect on this always stress this part, of course, with all those cliches. And I think it is also quite important to remember all the sarcasm that is also accompanies this, right? If we think of different kinds of poems or even falconry treatises that are written to mock a bit this kind of habit of the people who, are so important, and they dress so fine, and they go even in the churches, and they disturb the people from praying, and all of those things that are mentioned in the sources, and which gives us also such a vivid bodily feeling that we can almost think about it and imagine this today, even it is so far away from us. And so I think this is also a very important part of falconry. And it is the lower nobility, of course, as you mentioned. And we also even have some popes and some dignitaries of the church carrying falcons, not without any criticisms. And we also have in particular regions more common people that are allowed to carry a falcon, maybe not the gyr falcon, maybe something like the children used to have kestrels, or women, sparrowhawks, etc. So the respective falcon has also a lot to do with where are you in the hierarchy of society. And this is also reflected in the book of St. Albans, for instance, where it clearly states, for example, the gyr falcon, right, is for the prince and no one else. And where am I allowed to go hunting with my bird of prey? This is very well defined. And if you dare to do otherwise, I will kill you. It's quite clear. And this is not only around Europe, but also in Central Asia. People used to get blinded if they would touch the bird of prey of another person. And maybe you have seen those vervels that used to be put around hawks' feet, for instance, where they clearly stated, I belong to, for instance, the King of England. So dare you touch my bird. And what I try to say is we have a huge hierarchy as a kind of second order of society in the realm of birds, in the realm of people, obviously. But falconry is also a very strong weapon to emphasize status and power, but which goes beyond only the mere aristocracy. Because if we take the Bedouins, for instance, it started as a basic tool, a basic weapon to pursue quarry and get food, right? That's why in the Quran, it is already mentioned there. I allow you to pursue quarry with birds of prey.
I think it's important to bring up the religious example because this is something that is actually a criticism, as you're saying, that people take up with the church quite a lot. And when you think about the people who are entering the church, it's not just people who need 3 meals a day. It's also the nobility that are entering the church, especially the ones who are ending up in the higher orders of the church. And they're criticized about this, like, leave your falcons behind. I think in the book you have mentioned that the Third Lateran Council, I think the Pope says, stop taking your falcons on visitations because it's inappropriate. But if you've been raised with this as a sport and as a tool and as a pet, it's going to be hard to leave that behind.
Of course. And I mean, even the popes, some of the popes cannot leave it behind. So it's the highest, let's say, dignitary of the church. If one goes today to the palace in Avignon, which used to be the Pope Palace, then one sees around in the interior some beautiful frescoes, among which one sees really courtly themes among those falcons. And we also have some images where the Pope is leaving church to go hunting, and the church is crying. So it is a quite clear idea about this. But what I think is also at stake here, if we think that the Pope is the sovereign, right, on earth, representing Christ or Peter, in that sense, is also quite clear, because I think that the political issue that we talked about before, how falconry is a kind of state affair or a micrography of the state. So there, this notion flows into that part, because in order to, let's say, handle the church and the people, this could be a micrography through falconry. And it is not by any chance that also in ancient Greek, the word for falcon is hierax, and this word actually derives from the stem hieron, which is holy. So, I mean, we can have some kind of relations there and connections that go much further than, well, this is not good to do. But of course, those ecclesiastical voices have to say something about those naughty popes and people who take their hawks to the church, right?
Yeah, I'm sure that there are lots of people making arguments for keeping their hawks by saying, look, it's something that represents our society. It's totally normal. I should be allowed. And just as an aside for people who listen to my series, The Iron King, the Pope that is leaving the crying church behind is Clement V, who famously left Rome to build his papacy in Avignon. So yeah, he seems like the perfect person to be making fun of in that way. Okay.
Exactly.
So one of the places that we do find falcons popping up that you mentioned in the book is on women's mirrors. So it's time to talk about the relationship between especially chivalry, but the way that people speak about falconry and represent it in art, and the way they speak about women and represent them in art. So can you tell us a little bit about how that works?
Well, I mean, as already mentioned, I think the gender aspect is very important here. I mean, what are those animals? Who is handling them and in which way? This is why we have a big segment of aristocracy, medieval aristocracy, with women handling falcons. They are not so much involved, if you like, in serving the sovereigns with falcons, the cagers, although we have one, I think, example in the sources, but they are connected from the higher segments of aristocracy with the falcons, and they are also depicted also as such, and also with very precious materials. Of course, one has to stress here, we cannot have any illusions on that the people producing the artworks, they are producing them for, at that time, highest parts of the society, and it is at least aristocracy. So those people who do that use, of course, very precious materials, depicting a very precious activity like falconry. And I think it is also important to stress the fact of this relation between the materiality of the artwork and what it is depicting, right? And we have beautiful tapestries, so mobile images also showing women with men in the pursuit of falconry. For instance, if a visitor or someone listening to us from England, in London, the Victoria and Albert Museum, if you would like to go to the Devonshire tapestries, do that and you will find amazing details there.
Yes. And so what I was thinking of when I was thinking about the gendered aspect is not only that women are involved in it, but also that, well, I'm thinking about literature because that is the entry that I had into the Middle Ages. And there's all sorts of talk about the ways in which you will train a falcon and the ways in which you will train a woman.
Yes.
Thinking especially about the lure, right?
Yes, exactly. And what is also quite interesting, and we have the text and also the images, is of course, mostly we're talking about women lured by men, but we also have men lured by women through falconry or even from the same sex. So we have very different entangled relations there and very, of course, sensorial aspects that goes up to Shakespeare, Taming of the Shrew. It's full of those metaphors, right? And it is also quite clear and very interesting that Shakespeare used such a refined language and with terms that even today, I've talked with some falconers on this, some very specialized falconers cannot really tell, oh, what is he talking about here? What kind of term is this? So there is, even in the linguistic level, a highly differentiated way of talking exactly about power and gender relations through the example of falconry. And as I said before, we find this into the works of art, in prints, paintings, tapestries as well.
I'm really thinking about the Shakespeare thing because it's very interesting. His dad was a glover, right? So I wonder if he had a lot of contact with falconers, if his dad had to create gloves for falconers. Maybe that's the connection, although I'm just coming up with that now. So like nobody quote me on this in some sort of like dissertation or something like that.
That sounds like a quite plausible explanation. And I mean, we know that these people were so much also connected with one another. And what is also quite clear is the fact that all of those practitioners and craftsmen are connected to one another. We have as early as, for instance, a source from the 9th century that where it says like goldsmiths, falconers, dog handlers are somehow interconnected to one another. So definitely, and all this implicit knowledge that you are talking about, knowledge that it is not written, right? People talk about it and try to find connections or solutions. All of this implicit knowledge, I think it's very important, and its transmission. And of course, we as art historians or historians try to trace that and try to elevate that through the written sources on the one hand, even if this is the implicit source or knowledge, or through the images.
Mm-hmm. So as we wrap up, then that makes me think maybe this is a good time to invite you to tell people if they want to find out more about medieval falconry or indeed modern falconry, where should they start? Where would you direct them if people want to see either falconry in motion or have a look at what it was like in the Middle Ages?
Well, I would definitely tell them to look up around their houses and places. There are many places where one can experience falconry and even medieval falconry. So Google that, where you can find it around you. And of course, you have all of those museums which are full with falcons, even if one at the first glance, one would not recognize them. They're all around us. And as soon as we start dealing with subject, this is how it went with me at least, one finds falcons everywhere. And I would even say, look up your sky or the next church bell tower, we might find a falcon as well.
I love that. Look up because they are still part of the natural world. Hard to find
They are.
sometimes, but you will find them. Thank you so much, Yannis, for joining me to talk about falconry. It's just been a pleasure to speak to you about it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Danielle. It was great talking to you.
To find out more about Yannis' work, you can visit his faculty page at the University of Bonn or at academia.edu. His new book is The Art of Medieval Falconry. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. Well, we have some news about the Voynich manuscript.
Ooh.
This very mysterious manuscript that everyone's trying to figure out what it actually says. But Lisa Fagan-Davis, a friend of the podcast and one of the top scholars of the Voynich manuscript, has offered something really new. So she was able to come across 10 folios that have been specially scanned with like ultraviolet and infrared light. They were actually done 10 years ago, but for various reasons, they never came online and had never been studied yet.
Mm.
But so we have now a fascinating look at some hidden details in the manuscript. One of the exciting things is on the very first folio, someone tried to decipher it by putting in like Roman letters and some of the Voynich kind of lettering together and trying to figure it out. So that seems to have been done in the 16th century.
Detective work happening early.
Yeah. So it's very, very fascinating. So you can take a look at some of the images on our site, and we will direct you to where Lisa's doing her work, which is just in preliminary stages. But I'm sure it's going to be all aflutter with the Voynich manuscript people.
Well, if anyone can crack this, Lisa can do it. I have faith.
Indeed. So we have a piece on that. Plus, we have a piece on the Knights Templars, and they had a pet crocodile at their headquarters in Acre.
Of course they did. Is there anything those guys didn't do?
They got it. They tamed it, but they also made sure to remove all its teeth.
Oh, wow.
So we have that comes from a 14th century German source. So that's kind of fun. Plus, we have the travels of the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II. He did like a European tour.
Nice.
And we also have white collar crime on the Crusades.
Yeah.
So all that and more on medievalist.net.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Peter. And thanks for coming on and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
A big shout out to all the people out there making my work possible, whether that's letting the ads play through, telling your friends about my books and podcasts, proudly wearing a 5-minute medievalist shirt from tpublic.com, or becoming a patron at patreon.com. You can listen to the Medieval Podcast ad-free on Patreon for less than the cost of a single venti pumpkin spice latte. So if you love this podcast, please consider joining the Patreon community to help me keep it going. You can find out how at patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from hawks to crocs, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.